So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today. Need any introduction, perhaps? Dr. David Gay is Professor of English at the University of Alberta, where we all should be today. His monograph, Gifts and Graces, Prayer, Poetry, and Polemic, from Lancelot Andrews to John Bunyan, is out this year with University of Toronto Press. And his current project is on reading urban spaces in Milton, Bunyan, Blake, and Orwell. His paper today is entitled The Cities of the East in Paradise Regained. And let's all welcome him in our silent clapping sort of way here. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Leah. And good morning, everyone. So welcome and good morning, wherever you are. Paradise Regained is a hermeneutic combat between Satan and Jesus. For example, Jesus counters Satan's literalisms with metaphor, and all the city in the poems, in some sense, oppose the kingdom of heaven. In Rome, we have a binary of Christ and Caesar, in Athens of Jesus and Socrates, and Biblicism and classicism. I want to pursue that premise further with an emphasis on Babylon and Persepolis among the dozen or so eastern cities Milton names rather quickly, or Satan rather quickly, in the second temptation, the kingdoms of the world. I'll consider how urban spaces, as Milton depicts them, might extend our sense of the conflict of reading in the poem, and end with an unusual, perhaps, spatial representation of the poem to illustrate the activity of reading. In Paradise Regained, East and West are more limited than they are in Paradise Lost. Milton names cities along an east-west axis circumscribed by biblical geography. Jerusalem is the center point between East and West, particularly at the climax when Jesus stands on the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem. And so cities lie either east or west of that pinnacle. Rome and Athens, the major Western cities, received detailed treatment in the poem because Christianity expanded westward through the travels of Paul. As Dayton Haskin has argued, Paul may even be the model for the character of Jesus in Paradise Regained, at least especially the Athenian temptation. The cities of the East are more numerous, but are only briefly mentioned in a catalog in Book 3. This imbalance might seem to favor the West and scant the East. However, while no one city receives the attention of Rome or Athens, the volume of history, geography, and architecture in the East puts them on a more or less equal footing, I think, with Western cities. Milton may not seem to be very promising material for a study of urban spaces, and that's because there is really no overall or positive urban vision in his work, obviously compared to other writers. You could say there's no positive urban vision in Orwell, certainly, but just to account for that and illustrate the idea of urban space, I'll simply contrast London in 1644 with London in 1660 briefly. So Areopagitica seems to offer an exceptionally positive view of London. This is a well-known quotation you might recall. "Behold now this vast city, a city of refuge, the mansion house of liberty, encompassed and surrounded with his protection. The shop of war hath not there more anvils and hammers waking to fashion out the plates and instruments of armed justice in defense of beleaguered truth. Then there be pens and heads there, sitting by their studious lamps, musing, searching, revolving new notions and ideas, wherewith to present, as with their homage and their fealty, the approaching Reformation." And since, so that's a very busy city in a good way, but since we're dealing with the second temptation of kingdoms of the world, it's an interesting footnote to say that the word king never appears once in that treatise. Unlike The Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, written with apprehension and disappointment on the eve of the Reformation, he says at one point, in a republic or a free commonwealth, people live soberly in their families, walk the streets as other men, may be spoken to freely, familiarly, friendly, without adoration, whereas a king must be adored like a demigod. So that is quite a contrast. The first London is alive with pens and heads energizing the Reformation, but in 1660, London is a restoration parade. So this anti-urban vision of paradise regained may extend Milton's rejection of the glory of Restoration London. Space as a product of human activity is a premise of spatial theory. As Henri Lefebvre argues, social space is not a thing among other things, nor a product among other products. Rather, it subsumes things produced and encompasses their interrelationships and their coexistence in simultaneity. Urban geographer Tim Cresswell sees space not simply as geometric receptacle for human interactions. Place, which is the term all geographers and earth scientists prefer, subsumes histories, economies, ideologies, and other elements. Thus, Milton saw the energies of 1644 subsumed in 1660, except for the emerging literary culture of dissent, with which he sympathized. In the same way, the political and literary energies of ancient Rome and Athens are potential displacements of the emerging gospel in the poem, while the cities of the East also threaten to displace the gospel by subsuming Jesus' career into urban destruction and reconstruction, with Alexander the Great as a main model. Simultaneity is evident in the temptation narrative in Luke, which is, of course, Milton's source, the source Milton preferred for the three temptations. Luke's Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth in a single, quote, moment of time. All 4 points of the compass collapse in this enigmatic space-time singularity. Milton cites this moment at the end of Paradise Lost, when the good angel Michael shows Adam the future. Like Jesus, Adam stands on a high mountain, quote, whereon for different cause the tempter set our second Adam in the wilderness, to show him all earth's kingdoms and their glory. His eye might there command wherever stood city of old or modern fame, the seat of mightiest empire. And from there, Adam can see as far as Cusco in Peru, of course, the ancient Incan capital, but that's not the case in Paradise Regained. Adam sees cities through what Dennis Danielson calls the telescope of typology, that measures the race of time till time stand fixed. Beyond is all abyss, eternity whose end no eye can reach. This end no eye can reach captures the Hebrew word olam, or eternity, simply the farthest horizon of space. Milton does not explicate Luke's single moment of time in Paradise Regained, but I argue he does adapt it. In Rome, Satan presents aqueducts and arches, gardens and groves, with a strange parallax or optic skill of vision multiplied through air or glass of telescope. Multiplicity is the main feature of Satan's urban representation. Milton avoids explication because this is demonic art. Even so, the Greek source of the single moment is worth considering. Luke's phrase, a moment of time, is stigme chrono. Chrono is time, and stigma suggests a mark or brand on time. Patristic commentators saw Satan's mark on time not as evidence of some visionary or mystical transported state, but as evidence of the ephemerality of earthly cities. Ambrose remarks, for here it is not so much the rapid glance of sight which is signified, as is declared the frailty of mortal power. For in a moment all this passes by, and oftentimes the glory of this world has vanished before it arrived. Time as stigma questions the sources of mortal power in Luke. Milton, I think, adapts this partly by emphasizing mobility in the temptation episode. In Book 1, Jesus enters the wilderness without a map. Quote, the way he came not having marked. Very ordinary use of a verb, but I think it takes on some resonance with the gospel source. Also, he proceeds as then obscure, unmarked, unknown. So marking can mean to observe. It's very much associated with the eye in that point. Elsewhere in the poem, he says the only glory is when God marks the just man. marks us, not us marking time. These absent marks comment ironically on Luke's mark on time, in other words. Babylon is preeminent among the eastern cities. Quote, there Babylon, the wonder of all tongues, as ancient, but rebuilt by him who twice Judah and all thy father David's house led captive, and Jerusalem laid waste till Cyrus set them free. Babylon is the wonder of all tongues recalls the admiration of ancient historians, but also plays on the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel in Genesis, and its antitype, the tongues of Pentecost and the founding of the church in Jerusalem in Acts. The biblical Babylon signifies earthly power and the cycles of history. Nebuchadnezzar II captured Jerusalem in 597 BC and again in 586 when he led the people of Judah into exile. Cyrus of Persia captured Babylon in 538 and delivered Israel from exile. Cyrus is almost a messianic figure in the Hebrew Bible, notably Ezra chapter 1, quote, thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth and charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Again, this passage also mirrors the second temptation, since God, not Satan, gives Cyrus all the kingdoms of the earth. Satan's speech, however, reduces Cyrus to a footnote. This brevity may reveal more of Luke's moment of time, since the whole Babylonian captivity collapses into 3 lines of poetry. Babylon is named 356 times in the Bible. It is, of course, as we know, a mythic and metaphoric archetype, widely distributed through narrative and poetry. As Andrew Scheil remarks, classical texts describe Babylon's great political power and its passing, while the Bible expands the ultimate ephemerality of Babylonian tyranny. Classical writers marveled at the architectural achievement of the city, while biblical writers located in narratives of exile and deliverance. In contrast, Persepolis is named only once in the Bible and only once in this poem. Persepolis, his city there thou seest, and Bactra there, Ecbatana, her structure vast there shows, and Hecatompolis, her 100 gates. There Susa by Coaspi's amber stream, the drink of none but kings, of later fame built by Emathian or by Parthian hands, the great Seleucia, Nisibis, and there Artaxata, Pterodon, Ctesiphon. I put the word there in bold, as you can see, to show Satan's habit of connecting cities, almost like dots, but also elevating sight over sound or hearing, there, and there, like a tour guide, I suppose. A panoramic view. I also think the pronoun his in his city could be ambiguous as well, just as wonder of tongues has a certain underlying resonance with biblical passages. It connects the city to Cyrus since it was his winter city, but also, I would argue, Alexander, who later conquered the city and who is an implicit presence here and really throughout all of Paradise Regained. In Book 4, for example, Satan recalls Aristotle breeding great Alexander to subdue the world in Athens. Early in Book 3, right around line 30, which is an interesting numerological touch, age 30 for both Alexander and Jesus. At that point, Satan cites Alexander to mock Jesus as an underachiever who still lives with his mother and whose slender resume lacks epic scope. Alexander was the wonder of the world before turning 30, having won Asia and the throne of Cyrus, and was renowned as a builder and a prolific renamer of cities, usually in his own honor. The catalog evokes early modern travel writing as well. In Persepolis, Discovery and Afterlife of a World Wonder, Ali Musavi cites English writer Thomas Herbert, who visited in 1623, the ruins that is, and who was especially taken by the astounding construction materials used for the Palace of Darius. Musavi notes Herbert's inaccurate and grotesque views of the ruins, but his descriptions impressed a patron enough that he sent an artist to sketch them. and the artist, it seems, died on the way. In a passage that reveals his reliance on earlier sources, he notes how polished black marble walls perfectly mirrored the faces and bodies of viewers. Thus, art mirrors nature to create a lovely paradise in the palace of Persepolis. Quote, "In this palace, the king's throne was gold and oriental gems. The palace roof shined with gold, amber, silver, and ivory. His lodgings were rich too, for in one chamber was a vine studded with pearls. The artificial clusters were pearls and precious rubies. His bed's pillow, saith the author, was bolstered with 5,000 talents of gold, and his bed's feet with 3,000. Both gold and vine was given Darius by the Bithynian Pythias. Many rare things more are reported of this lovely paradise." Pseudo-paradises are features of all the cities Satan presents, including Rome's gardens and the olive grove of Academe, which you see behind me, but also in Athens in the poem. This palace in Persepolis is an entirely artificial garden with fruits and vines made of jewels and metals. Alexander burned Persepolis in 329 BC. In Itinerarium Todius Sacri Scripturae, or the Travels of Biblical Figures, the German pastor Heinrich Bunting tells how Alexander held a drunken victory celebration, and that notable courtesan Thias, perceiving the king inclined to mirth and full with wine, cajoled him into burning the city to avenge Xerxes' attack on Athens in 480 BC. The partygoers threw their torches into the palace, where, quote, "there was a great abundance of cedar, and the whole city was therewith fired and burnt to the ground. This was the end of that mighty city which ruled over so many nations, where so many mighty princes governed, that was the scourge of Greece and the greatest part of the world. There being at this day nothing to be seen." Alexander repented the burning of the city and rebuilt it, as Bunting notes, quote, "after it turned to the great shame of the Macedonians that their king should fire so famous a city in the midst of his cups." Satan narrates the history of the region from the dissolution of Alexander's empire to the present Parthian Empire. Jerusalem is now surrounded by Rome and Parthia, and Satan advises Jesus to side with the Parthians for security. Quote, "But say thou wert possessed of David's throne, by free consent of all, none opposite, Samaritan or Jew. How couldst thou hope long to enjoy it quiet and secure between two such enclosing enemies, Roman and Parthian? Therefore one of these thou must make sure thy own, the Parthian first, by my advice, as nearer and of late found able by invasion to annoy thy country, and captive lead away her kings. The western cities of Rome and Athens invite readers to inhabit them and explore their cultural legacies. The cities of the East unfold quickly as if to provoke impatience and create a dissonance of chronology and geography, and heighten spatial anxiety. These effects are more suited to military action than academic leisure at Athens. Satan's mapping makes Jerusalem a vulnerable but strategic geopolitical center of the world. And this anticipates the climax of the poem in Jerusalem, where Satan places Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, at the midpoint between eastern and western cities, ranged concentrically around him. To briefly conclude, sorry. There it is. Got two different images there. If we plot cities using Jerusalem as the centering point, we can imagine west and east in balance, with the journey through cities viewed concentrically rather than simply the linear axis of east and west. And I'm working with this partly because I'm also looking at later industrial writers, I believe, industrial and age writers, who I believe were influenced by Milton and reflect the emergence of the labyrinthine as a metaphor for urban complexity, even dystopic complexity. That would be Blake and Orwell. So I'm imagining the cities here using the image of a labyrinth, perhaps experimentally. This one is a very rudimentary quote, pagan labyrinth, as opposed to the fourfold labyrinth you might find in a medieval cathedral. Milton's references to labyrinths are rare and negative, as in the leafy labyrinth of Comus, a poem that I think remarkably anticipates much of his major poetry, and in some ways, Paradise Regained. The labyrinthine serpent body in Paradise Lost. But the labyrinth is also a multifaceted emblem of spiritual direction, urban complexity, and I would add intensive reading. Milton doesn't use the word here, but he does use the word way frequently in his major poems, and quite frequently in this poem. It can, of course, mean the biblical text, Jesus as the way and the truth and the life in John 14, but also the way of the reader following a path of text, perhaps like Michel de Certeau's vagabond reader walking through cities. But in this case, the path is unicursal because the way is dissenting, transgressive, and resistant in Milton's case. Satan constructs a widening outer circle of cities before threatening Jesus with the circle closing around Jerusalem. As a reader, he connects cities like dots quite rapidly to suggest a royal progress or military campaign. His production of urban space is typically multiple, polychronic, and disorienting, while Jesus is singular, present, and centered. The poemist's hermeneutic combat combines the metaphoric movements of reading and walking through cities offered by spatial theorists, while emphasizing the emerging textual space, specifically the gospel, as a space for criticizing rather than rationalizing militarism and monumentalism. Thank you.